Hello, everyone. Good evening. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. So thank you all so much for coming out. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's annual Manfred Vogel Memorial Lecture in Judaic Studies. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing myself and saying just a little bit about the Crown Family Center here at Northwestern. My name is David Shayevitz. I'm a professor of Jewish history here in the History Department, and I'm currently serving as the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. It's wonderful to see a lot of familiar faces here in the crowd tonight, and I look forward to getting to know those of you I haven't yet had a chance to meet. Let me start by just acknowledging quickly the people who've made tonight's lecture possible. First, I want to express my gratitude to Henry and Maria Vogel, who together with their family endowed the Vogel Lecture 7 years ago to honor their father, Manfred Vogel, a longtime pillar of the Northwestern community. Unfortunately, Henry and Maria were not able to be here tonight, but we're so grateful for their support and for this really meaningful way they've chosen to honor their father's memory. Let me also thank two members of the Crown Center's administrative team, Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, who I think are there in the back. Thank you. Without whom this event and really all of our events would not be possible, so thanks to them. For those of you who are attending the Vogel Lecture for the first time tonight, I hope you'll permit me to say just a word or two about Manfred H. Vogel, whose memory we're honoring this evening, and about the Crown Center and its mission. Manfred Henry Vogel was born in 1930 in Tel Aviv and immigrated to the United States as a teenager. He earned his bachelor's degree at Wayne State University, his rabbinical ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and a PhD in religious philosophy at Columbia University. His dissertation, which is about 19th century religious thought, foreshadowed what would become a career-spanning interest in modern religious philosophy, which eventually resulted in foundational studies of Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, and other Jewish theologians, as well as intensive engagement with Jewish-Christian dialogue and relations. After a stint at Brandeis University, Professor Vogel arrived at Evanston in 1962 as the director of the Northwestern Hillel, a position he held for 3 years. And then in 1965, he transitioned from his position there to an assistant professorship, 2 years after that to an associate professorship, only 4 years after that to a full professorship, and for the next 35 years, until his retirement in 2004 and his passing in 2013, Professor Vogel educated generations of students, published dozens of books and articles, and also helped to cement the field of Jewish studies at Northwestern, where it's continued to flourish and to thrive. Now, today, Jewish studies is more than ever an integral component of academic life here at Northwestern and of communal life in the greater Chicago area. The Crown Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, which is the descendant of the Jewish Studies program that Professor Vogel helped to found, today boasts over a dozen full-time faculty members who specialize in ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Ladino literature, Holocaust studies, and study of the politics, history, and culture of the State of Israel. Undergraduate students at Northwestern can major and minor in Jewish studies. Graduate students from many different fields collaborate in the university's Jewish Studies Graduate Cluster, and an array of postdoctoral fellows and affiliated scholars join the Crown Center each year to continue their training and to prepare for careers in and beyond the academy. In addition to this inward-facing activity, the Crown Center also faces outward to the broader public and hosts events and programming designed to bridge the gap between the university and the Chicagoland community. And so let me take just an opportunity to direct your attention to the sheets that you may have gotten on your way in, or if you haven't gotten them yet, feel free to take one. I want to plug one of our upcoming public programs, which is that next week we'll be hosting Ambassador Professor Itamar Rabinovich, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, former president of Tel Aviv University, former negotiator on Israel's behalf with Syria, really outstanding scholar and public intellectual who we're really happy to be hosting. So take a look at that sheet for more details. Our website address can also be found there, and you can always go to our website to find out more information about how to get involved with Jewish studies here at Northwestern. Now, it's a real pleasure for me to welcome tonight's Vogel speaker, Professor David Ruderman, who is the Joseph Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Pennsylvania. From 1994 to 2014, he was also the Ella Dariovoff Director of Penn's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, and Professor Ruderman was one of the pioneers in the field of early modern Jewish history and the author or editor of 15 books, hundreds of articles, and reviews. He's the recipient of 2 National Jewish Book Awards, the Koret Book Award, numerous teaching awards, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Foundation for Jewish Culture. He's the former president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and as I'm reading through this bio, I'm realizing I don't have all night to read all of these accolades, so you'll have to trust me that there's a lot that I'm cutting out here that speaks to our speaker's really distinguished profile. Prior to his teaching at Penn, he held named chairs at Yale University and at the University of Maryland. In both places, he was instrumental in establishing Jewish studies programs there. And I also want to just add briefly a personal note, which is that I first met Professor Ruderman nearly 20 years ago when I walked into his classroom on the University of Pennsylvania's campus for what I was certain would be an easy A. I'd come from a Jewish day school background, I'd studied in a rabbinical seminary, and I was pretty certain that there was nothing that any university professor could possibly teach me about Jews and Judaism that I didn't already know. And it became quickly apparent that my smugness was matched only by my naivete. For Professor Ruderman opened my eyes to a surprising, complex, nuanced, really fascinating Jewish history that recast everything I thought I knew about the Jewish tradition. And indeed, it shaped the course of my life in that I quickly decided that I too wanted to be a Jewish history professor when I grew up. Professor Ruderman's career has been devoted to uncovering the neglected, misunderstood, sometimes repressed elements of the Jewish tradition in ways that add richness and texture to what we know, or what we think we know, about Jewish history. And I'm sure that tonight's lecture on the revival of Jewish-Christian debate in 19th century Europe will be no exception. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Ruderman.
Good evening, and thank you. First thing I want to say is it's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to be the Vogel Lecturer. I did meet Professor Vogel several times in the past. I wish he was here tonight because one of the things that I'm doing is trying to expand the canon of 19th century Jewish thought in dealing with the weird figures that I'm dealing with this evening. And I would very much have liked to hear his opinion, but I'll just have to imagine that. The other thing, it's an enormous honor to be hosted by a beloved student. We are all in this profession because of the joy of having students like David Shiowitz. It is a true delight to see him as a leader of Judaic studies here on campus and in his own field. As I say, you know, the Latin word nachas, that is the way I feel right now. Now, that is not the title of the lecture, although it's close to it, but I just happen to have a few slides from a previous lecture, so it is there. But ignore that for the moment. Take a look at this thing over here, which I want to explain to you before we go any farther. And then I want to sort of explain to you what I'm doing with this topic, which is way outside my own field. But you know, when you get to be 75 years old, you can do anything you want and get away with it. I don't have to get tenure or anything. This was a labor of love. Whether it's right or wrong or not, we will find out. The book will be coming out in March. And we'll also, this is marking my last year, my 45th year as an academic. I am what's called in transition, getting used to the idea of being retired, but not quite yet, so I'm still quite here. So take a look at that picture, and you see there are two folks there. They didn't introduce them in the flyer, but the flyer is very catchy. On the left is, well, let me start on the right. The right is Alexander McCall, who is a Protestant evangelical missionary. And we'll get to him in a second. On the left is Isaac Bear Levinson, known as the father of the Eastern European Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, or the Moses Mendelssohn of Eastern Europe, if you like to call him, famous for an essay that he wrote called Tu'udah B'Yisrael, I don't know how, Document of Israel or something like that, Message of Israel, which is really a clarion call for enlightenment of Eastern European Jews, written in the early 19th century, which became clearly a major polemical treatise, which was published and republished and made him famous in Eastern Europe. And you will see the two, as I suggest, are having a conversation or a debate. So we will see. So they are put side by side, and I think you can tell who the Jew is and who is the Christian. Now, I guess the first question you are probably asking yourself, what is a nice Jewish boy, or rather old man, writing about missionaries and converts? Is that the proper thing that a Jewish historian should be doing? And I think it's a legitimate question, because clearly there has always been within Jewish culture a kind of stigma. Oh, you'll forgive me, one other apology before I begin, and that is that I can't read my notes because I'm having a cataract in another week or two. So I'm using the technical word, I'm winging it this evening. You'll forgive me, all right? So I do have notes here, but I can't actually read a word. So I think I can see that, but you'll forgive me if it's a little disjointed, but it certainly will be fresh and free and booming at you. So I hope you will enjoy it. But back to my question. One of the products of the academic study of Judaism is that there are no holds barred, there are no limits to what we can study. And we at least try to study the past, warts and all, without any particular subjective involvement in that past. Of course, that's impossible. All history is autobiographical in one sense. But nevertheless, the scope of Jewish studies, particularly in recent years, have expanded. We have, for example, a whole field of the study of the Jewish convert, both in the Middle Ages, that David knows quite well, but particularly in the modern period. Most recently, Todd Engelman in 2015 published a major work on converts. We have one of the colleagues who studied with David at Penn, Eli Schenker, who has just produced a wonderful book on Jewish converts in 19th century Russia. So the field is expanding. In other words, converts that were considered in Hebrew or Yiddish by the derogatory term Meshummadim or Meshummadim. I'm trying to say it in Yiddish, but it's not coming out. But it's the same word, basically a kind of negative connotation of converts because they had left the Jewish fold. They were responsible for shmad, which is a kind of death, a kind of disaster. They were considered outside the pale of what good Jewish scholars study. But clearly, our interest in the convert has been extremely profound. We see the convert as an intermediary between Jews and Christians. We see converts who convert but somehow remain Jewish. We see what has interested me throughout my entire career, which is the study of mingled identities. Or as Natalie Zeman Davis, I've quoted her this afternoon, I quote her again, braided identities. And this has always fascinated me. We don't have one identity, we have many. And sometimes we link them together in very creative ways. And one of the things that you will take away from this evening is to the extent which converts could be both Jews and Christians simultaneously, or at least they tried. They made that effort. They were part of two worlds simultaneously, and they combined and conjoined these worlds in very creative ways. The missionary is another story. Missionaries, I guess one of my reasons that, now I lost that picture altogether. What do I do? You're here.
Don't have any better ideas than you do, I don't think.
Oh, no?
I think tech support's on its way, so.
All right. Get me back the picture. Okay. If not, I will do without it. I can't see it anyway. Alexander McCall, as I said, was a missionary. And why would I be interested in missionaries? Yeah, that's what I did. You have to start with that again?
Do you want to give me your flash drive?
Oh, flash drive, okay. Here we go.
Okay.
And then we have to look for McCall files.
Okay.
Yeah.
You continue talking.
Okay. McCall was an evangelical. Microphone. Yeah, okay. Now I feel like a singer, a rock star. And you said up or down? This way. Is that on?
Nope,
No.
the other way.
Oh. Hello? How's that? Okay. Alexander McCall was an evangelical missionary. Why would I be interested in him? Well, his story is very interesting. I'm going to start by telling his story. I don't know how many Jewish historians have worked on missionaries per se, but the field of missionary studies, of mission, and particularly the 19th century mission, is an enormous subject in its own right, with a lot of scholars who have studied the missionary, both within the context of Europe, but beyond the world, as part of the story of colonialism and imperialism in the 19th century. So clearly, McCall fits into a much larger picture. But the organization that he was involved with, and was one of its leaders, is called the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Amongst the Jews. Of all things, in the 19th century, this was the largest missionary organization ever to be founded. We're back on? Yes, thank you. All right. All right, there's Alexander, and there's his lovely wife. And that's him over there. And notice there are two different pictures. They look very different, but these are the two pictures that remain of Alexander McCall. Why would I be interested in McCall? McCall was one of the leaders of the London Society. This society had millions of pounds. It was an English society, and it spread throughout the entire continent, into Africa, into Asia, trying to convert primarily Jews. There were other, of course, missions to Muslims and to Hindus and to Buddhists and so on, but McCall was interested in converting Jews. Now, this is an old story on the one hand. On the other hand, as you will see, it's also quite a modern story. Alexander McCall, in 1821, after being ordained as a minister, was sent to Warsaw, Poland, as an emissary of the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews. He spent almost 10 years in Warsaw, and he learned Yiddish and he learned Hebrew. And ultimately, and he trained his kids. You will notice, now where'd that go? Over here. Is that right? Yeah. These are all of his children. I have nothing to say about them except most of them were clerics. But Elizabeth Ann McCall Finn wrote a biography of her father, or an entire memoir of her life. Her husband was James Finn, who was the consul general in Jerusalem, and both of them made Aliyah and lived in Israel. And she tells the story of how in her father's house, sitting in Warsaw, he would study Talmud every day with Jews. He would study Hebrew, and he spoke only Hebrew and Yiddish. And she corresponds. She writes in Yiddish, and she writes in Hebrew, and they became participants in this extraordinary Jewish dialogue. Eventually, he goes back to England, and there he creates a seminary for training evangelicals, ministers, to propagate the Christian faith among Jews in a place in East London which at that time called Palestine Place, a wonderful name. I actually went back with a colleague of mine, and we traced all the steps of this place. It's hardly recognizable anymore, but an entire campus where mostly former Jews were coming to learn how to become missionaries to other Jews. And eventually, he published over 50 works, including commentaries on biblical books, all kinds of other essays on the study of Hebrew and Judaism, and he was promoted to become a full professor of post-biblical Judaism at King's College London. One of the great experiences of writing this book was to be invited to give a series of lectures in the same department where McCall was in religious studies at King's College. And there, all these evangelical types showed up in the audience. It was really quite remarkable, I felt, with big crosses and all kinds of things. And I was sitting there, and this Jew was talking about their hero. But it was quite an experience. McCall is interesting because he's a lover of Judaism. He's a lover of Hebrew. He's a lover of Jewish learning. The kinds of things that he says about the Jewish community are really quite impressive. Well, I just want to go on a little bit more. I'm going to drop these pictures in a second. These are more children. You see, he was very prolific as well in this area. I don't have all the pictures, but most of them. These are the reminiscence of Mrs. Finn that I mentioned to you before. By the way, if you go on Google him, or actually go on Amazon.com, I'm very jealous because all of his books are still in print and they are read. And I'm convinced that the evangelicals will discover me when this book comes out, and they will also be reading about Alexander McCall. This was one of the people that he converted. And he describes this guy walked around looking like a Jew after he converted as well. And you can read, I can't read it, so you just take a look at, this is from Moses Margoliot. I'm going to talk about him in a second, who was another one of the converts who I studied. And this is what triggers this whole book. A text called The Old Paths, or in Hebrew, Nitivot Olam. What I'm looking at here are all the English versions. This one, as you see, is very recent. And this was written in 1837 when he came back to England. And it is a book against the Talmud, against the rabbis. It is part of a long literature of anti-rabbinic writings written by Christians. But as you will see, this book is quite novel. Number one, in terms of its modern arguments. Number two, in terms of its distribution. The London Society took this as the primary text in which to convert Jews, and then went ahead and translated it into a variety of languages. So here's the German, there's the Hebrew. The Hebrew is what made an enormous impact because it reached Eastern Europe and was circulated among the Jews of Eastern Europe, who became a bit panic-stricken by this book and needed to defend their own interests, and that is the other part of the story, the Jewish defense against the missionary. Here is, let me do it again. This is a translation of, the translation of the prayer book, and this is the English liturgy, correct? Am I looking at it right? Translated to Hebrew. On Friday nights, they would daven, but they would daven from the English Book of Prayer. And this was what the missionaries were learning. This is a work which is extraordinary. It is a book about a chapter on Hasidim, a chapter on Reformed Jews, a chapter on glimpses of the Jewish women, which I will talk about in just a second. It is a book which shows that the ambivalence, the fluidity of his views. Yes, he was anti-Talmudic, but he loved Jews. He loved Jewish learning. He goes on, page after page, talking about how civilized Jews are, how learned they are, how they publish so many books, how they take Judaism so seriously, and one cannot miss at all their extraordinary piety and their extraordinary sincerity. This goes on, and as you will see, as his career progresses, he becomes more and more associated as a kind of Judaizer. That is, someone that identifies too strongly with his subject. So here again is this remarkable ambivalence, and I will finish with talking about that in just a second, but just one or two more pictures, then I'm going to abandon a PowerPoint. I'm an early modernist, so all my books that are written, as David mentioned, were written in the early modern period. One of them, one of the characters of the early modern period is a figure named Isaac Arroyo de Castro, an extraordinary Jew who polemicizes with Spinoza, among others, in Amsterdam in the 17th century. This work was translated into English, and McCall saw it, and he decided in the 19th century to retranslate it himself and to write a refutation of it. So here we have a wonderful 19th century figure writing about a 17th century figure and trying to argue that this individual who was originally a Christian, converted to Judaism, is really the worst thing you can say about a 19th century person. He's Catholic, popery. And since he's a Catholic because he's a Catholic Jew, he grew up in Amsterdam and he knows Judaism through Catholic lens. And since Protestants hate Catholics, that's the worst thing you could possibly say about him. So here is another work by McCall, and I'm going to finish with this. And I just had to show you that you can buy all these on Amazon. I'm not selling his books, but clearly he was popular. I want to say just a couple of things about the Old Paths, or Nitivot Olam. What is new about this book is the kind of argument that emerges. There's a section on the Jew and the non-Jew, and how rabbinic literature does not treat the non-Jew as well as the Jew. In other words, this dual morality. It is answered and responded to by the Jews, as we will see, fully, and it's not quite fair, the argument he makes, but nevertheless, within the context of Jewish-Christian relations in the 19th century, this argument stands out. He has a chapter on Reform Judaism as well, and that is a very interesting aspect of this. In 1840, the first Reformed synagogue emerges in London, and according to McCall, he was influential in moving these Jews halfway from Judaism to Christianity. And he was hoping that they would eventually go all of the way and become good Protestants. But of course they don't, and as time goes on, he becomes more and more frustrated with these Reformed Jews that simply won't give up the rabbis altogether, which they should, since they're Reformed Jews. But of course, he misunderstood their intentions. The third argument that is unique about this book, which is the most interesting, is the treatment of women. You have to know something about evangelicals in the 19th century and the place of women and women's spirituality, which I have learned a great deal about in reading for this book. Clearly, for him, the Protestant woman was treated better than the Jewish woman. But there is something really quite fascinating. As McCall travels all around Eastern Europe and he meets all kinds of Jews, he tells us he discovers a book, a little book, and he describes it in great detail, a manuscript, and in it are all kinds of poems. And these poems are called tchinis, or tchinot. These are prayers written by women or for women by men about women's kinds of things, about the period, about baking challah, about lighting candles. And these are poems which Chava Weissler, in the last couple of years, has written a wonderful book on, describing a kind of women's spirituality that emerges in the 19th century. 100 years before Chava Weissler, McCall finds these poems and translates them and praises the Jewish woman. Of course, he uses the Jewish woman as a foil against the Jewish man. The Jewish man is the one that keeps down the Jewish woman. But nevertheless, it is quite clear that, am I too loud like when I'm doing like this? Should I talk softer? No? I guess I should contrast, right, if I'm up here presenting myself. But in any case, the Jewish woman emerges here as a kind of heroine in his story. So again, we have this ambiguity, this fluidity. Are there Jews versus Christians? Yes, there are. Is a polemic going on, which had been going on for almost 1,000 years? Yes. But nevertheless, there are nuances which are really quite interesting here. The last thing I want to say about McCall, before I introduce all the other characters in this book, is the following. In the last 5 years of his life, everything changes. He was born in 1799, he died in 1863. 5 years before that, he resigned from the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Among the Jews over two issues. One were financial misgivings about how the organization was spending its money, but more significantly, because he believed, and here is another aspect of our story, that the purpose of his missionary organization was to bring Jews to Israel, to have them living the Christian faith, but retaining their Jewish identity as Jewish Christians. And they would bring about the second coming of Christ. In other words, for him, the settlement of Israel was a primary factor in the coming of Christ, in bringing about the millennium. And therefore, he promoted the idea of his converts and a convert community emerging in Jerusalem. The bishop of Jerusalem, a guy named Gobet, disputed the significance of this act. There were not enough Jews, and these Jews were not sincere in the Christian faith, and they got into a major feud. And people were arrested, there were fights, there were all kinds of things going on in the middle of the 19th century, and he was deeply upset. It had been his mission. What we are describing here is something that is very significant in terms of the history of Zionism, and that is Christian Zionism, or the place of evangelicals in the ideology of building the state right up until the Balfour Declaration in 1917. In other words, we have here evangelical background, a Christian need for Jewish settlement. And all we have to do is refer to the world we live in today, and the support of evangelicals for Israel is to understand that whole history. But that history begins already in the beginning of the 19th century, and even before, but certainly in this period of time. So McCall is a kind of Zionist. He would himself been the Bishop of Jerusalem, but he believed that someone of the Jewish ancestry, someone with Jewish blood coursing his veins, only he can be a person who is in charge of Jerusalem and this community. So he believed fervently in this fact, even though he could not get many Jews not only to come to Israel, but to convert to the Christian faith and to create this community of Jewish Christians. In the end, one other thing happens. In the last 5 years of his life, all of a sudden there is an explosion of new works within the evangelical community and beyond, critiquing the Bible and critiquing in particularly the literalist view of the Bible. All of a sudden, Christian fundamentalism and literalism were challenged. The Bible now can be subjected to archaeology. It can be subjected to literary criticism. What we are speaking about are the origins of biblical criticism in England and in Europe as a whole. He is frightened. He is a literalist. He is a premillennialist. He is a person who is deeply committed to reading the Bible as it is, and he is deeply committed to the Hebrew Bible. All of these things seem to be shattered by a whole new criticism that emerged in the early 1860s. The last 6 or 7 works of McCall are all written against the biblical critics. And what emerges here is a transformation from a missionary to a defender of the literal biblical text. It is a very interesting transmission. It took me a while to figure out what are the connection between being a missionary and then finally becoming a defender of the biblical text. And indeed, what emerges is kind of his own understanding of the purity of the Jewish vision, which for him was the Old Testament, was the Tanakh. And therefore, anything that was critical of it, either the rabbis transforming it into their own image, or the biblical critics transforming the Bible into something else, was something he could not settle with. So therefore, the literalist McCall, right up till the day of his death, becomes a defender of Hebrew and the biblical text. Again, a certain ambiguity, a certain way of understanding this identity which had identified so truly with Jews that in these debates where he is also criticized, they single him out as being too Jewish, too involved in his subject, too loving of the Jewish community and the Jewish past, which his critics make fun of. But clearly here again, a missionary who devotes his life, I'm not defending him or attacking him, but nevertheless tried to show you what happens when a person goes into this community and is deeply affected by it and is transformed by this kind of experience. So that is McCall, and McCall is really the trigger which sets up the entire book. But the book isn't about McCall, only the first 3 chapters. What is the rest of the book about? And what do you think that is, that noise going off? Oh, okay. It's not telling me to stop? I was telling David Chowitz before, my father was a rabbi, and one of the most humiliating experiences in my life as a rabbi's son was one of the congregations he served would have up here a clock that read for 20 minutes. And after 20 minutes, the alarm went off. And I was ready to sit down. You don't have that here, do you? All right. So let me introduce the 7. I'm not going to spend as much time on them because McCall is clearly the center of this book. So the book is about 2 other evangelicals. It is about 2 converts, and it is about 3 Jews. What I try to argue is that while I can't imagine all 8 people sitting in one room, one way or another they are speaking to each other. So it's the reconstruction of a conversation. And it's doing so, let me first of all introduce these people and to do it much more briefly. The 2 evangelicals, one is John Oxley, and another is a woman named Charlotte Elizabeth Tona. Actually, no one ever knew about a rather minor figure, but a figure that was a genius that knew 60 languages and that wrote a 3-volume work trying to show that Jewish sources reveal Jesus Christ. Again, an old theme within Jewish Christian polemical literature, but demonstrating a remarkable knowledge, perhaps twisted a bit, but nevertheless a remarkable knowledge of Judaism. But what is interesting about John Oxley, and you will see also Charlotte Elizabeth Tona, is that both of them were critics of Alexander McCall, although both were evangelicals. They believed that the conversion of the Jews was imminent, like McCall, and they strive for that reality. But they believe that by forcing Jews to convert or persuading them or pressuring them was something that was really unfair and was simply unjust. And therefore, they ultimately believe that by Jews being Jews, ultimately Christ would come in his own way. They argued that it was possible to remain Jewish, and they were against the harassment techniques of the London Society. So they became both critics of the London Society. Charlotte Elizabeth Tona, was a well-known figure within women evangelical movement. She published a journal called the Christian Women's Magazine. She was blind, but she became, despite her disability, a fiery personality in defending Jews and pointing out the anti-Semitism that was going on all over the world and arguing indeed for Jewish settlement, and John Oxley as well. Both of them did not have much to do with each other, but both of them came essentially from the same paths. And what is really interesting, and this is what I want to point out about two of them, in the middle of the 19th century emerges the Jewish press. First, a journal called The Voice of Jacob, published by a Jew named Jacob Franklin, and then later on the famous Jewish Chronicle, which is still published today. The Voice of Jacob is a very unusual kind of publication. It's very different from the kind of Jewish newspapers that I read weekly in Philadelphia, in that Christians began to write for it. John Oxley was a regular writer for this journal, and so was Charlotte Elizabeth. And in fact, Charlotte Elizabeth was a very close friend of Jacob Franklin. And when she died, Jacob Franklin wrote an obituary in The Voice of Jacob about her. In other words, both Oxley and Tona were friends of the Jews. They were against the London Society. So it was possible in this very fluid, ambiguous world of Jewish-Christian relations for Jews to somehow appreciate Christian missionaries who were not aggressive, who were not offensive, who were defending Jewish rights and Jewish interests. In other words, picking who our friends are, or at least not our enemies, versus the enemies or people like McCall. So what emerged, therefore, were two critics of the London Society, which were ultimately befriended by the Jewish press, and they became special friends. The story of John Oxley is even more interesting. When he wrote a work called Three Letters, which were about the London Society refused to publish it. They simply had repudiated his stance and distanced themselves from his position. He went to his friend Jacob Franklin, who published the work under a Jewish auspices. Again, this is a missionary work, but it was published by Jews, who saw, with all of his crazy theology, still a friend of the Jews. And here we see how positions sort of mutate and how different people line up in the scale of things when Jews are trying to defend their own interest and their own rights within the context of a hostile missionary society, which was trying to convert Jews in England and elsewhere. Now the two converts. One is named Stanislaw Hoga, and the other is Moses Margoliot. And here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Hoga was born in Poland, and he met Alexander McCall in Poland, who converted him. But he was a Hasid. He came from the seer of Lublin's family, and he was a very learned Jew who was very involved with publications in Polish and in Hebrew before his conversion. He then seems to have left his wife, and he ends up eventually as married to a Christian woman, and he has 2 children with her. And all of a sudden, he disappears and reappears in London. 2 years later, McCall publishes his The Ways of the World, his famous work against the Talmud. And soon after that, Stanislaw Hoga translates the work into Hebrew. And begins to publish these other translations. The Book of English Prayer, for example, is the work of Hoga as well. Hoga now becomes a employee of the London Society. But over the course of the next 10 years, Hoga becomes disenchanted. He simply cannot understand the harassment tactics of these missionaries. He feels they are simply exploiting the poor and the vulnerable within the Jewish community. And indeed, the kind of converts they produced are not sincere in the first place. What he ultimately argues for is that I believe in Jesus Christ, he says, but I also believe in the halakha. I believe in Jewish law. And therefore, I want to observe Shabbat. I want to observe all of the Jewish laws, at the same time believe in Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was also a Jew. And therefore, I am doing exactly what he said, not to destroy the law, but to affirm, to confirm the law. And therefore, Stanislaw Hoga becomes a Jewish Christian in the full sense of the word, and separates himself totally from McCall and completely repudiates his past and his working for McCall in this translation, which becomes, as I said, the most popular anti-rabbinic work of the 19th century. Moses Margoliot is even more complex. He came also from Poland and came to England at a very young age, was converted in Liverpool, and eventually makes his way to London, where the London Society grabs him, and he publishes a work on the essential principles of modern Judaism, where he attacks such things as phylacteries and tallis, the hinges, and the mezuzah. And he goes on to show that all of modern Judaism is a fabrication of the rabbis. The Jews, of course, hate this book, and they hate him. And he becomes a kind of adversary against the Jewish community. But in the meantime, something is happening. We have, for an early modernist, this is really unbelievable. When it enters the 19th century, the kind of documentation we find is just totally unbelievable. I found, actually through a student of mine, a whole cachet of letters written by Margoliot, where he talks about his problems with his marriage and why he left his wife, and goes into intimate detail about his sexual life. I won't even share it with you. It's not for public consumption. But it was unbelievable how much I learned about this man. This man describes, he leaves his wife at a certain point and runs off to the land of Israel to see the Holy Land. And in this diary of his trip through the Middle East, he describes his encounters with Jews and with Christians, his singing Jewish songs. He's totally fascinated with Jewish music, with Jewish liturgy, with Jews. He's so proud of the Jewish woman. He goes on and on about only someone like me who knows Hebrew and is a Jew in his heart can appreciate what it means and he recites Yehuda Halevi's poetry at the wall in Jerusalem. And he sees the Keter Damesek. He is shown a copy of one of those rare books of the Bible that appeared in the 19th century. On and on, describing Jewish objects and Jewish music and Jewish feeling. The Jewishness comes out, and here, this is a Protestant preacher who is going around supposedly to missionize among the Jews. And then he goes back and he writes a novel. I had the chance of reading his novel, which is a critique of the hypocrisy of the Protestant clergy and the so-called friends of the Jewish people. Every time you see friends, know that they're really not your friends at all. In the end, he becomes totally disillusioned with his Protestant ancestry and criticizes the London Society and ends up remaining a Christian, but nevertheless a strong critic of the missionaries and a lover of Jewish learning and Jewish scholarship, particularly the Sephardic world, poetry, Halevi, philosophy, and he writes an enormous amount of books. Again, another intellectual figure that has made his career as a convert. I have now just to talk about 3 Jews. These Jews, David, when did I start? I have no idea of the time. Yeah, I know it's good, but I should just keep going on. All right, I'm looking now. All right, I have to end at some point. But you see, when you get me started, I won't stop. But I will. So why did I, in the end, I must tell you, I must confess, as I said, all history is autobiography. So when I read McCall's work for the first time, wow, that's really convincing. Maybe he has something here. Maybe, I should look into this, I was really touched by, his arguments are so sophisticated and so eloquently written against the rabbis. But then, of course, I picked up his Jewish adversaries. And after reading Isaac Bear Levinson, that's the guy on the left, I came back to the Jewish faith. He was better. He really smart. You read these things as an historian, of course, but I'm only playing with you. But indeed, what emerged out of this moment was a Jewish response, an enormous Jewish response. I have at least 11 books that were written against McCall. Most of them were written in Hebrew. There were several in German and in English as well. I studied 3 of them for this book. 3 Hebrew books, actually 4, because Isaac Bear Levinson wrote 2 books against McCall. Sitting in the Ukraine, he wrote 2 books against McCall. So what we're talking about here is an international story. The story begins in England, but now it crosses into Eastern Europe. And who is going to answer him? Well, Moses Montefiore, the great rich Jew and philanthropist of England, runs off to Eastern Europe because he knows there's no one smart enough in England to write a response to Alexander McCall. So he finds among the Jews of Eastern Europe, he goes to the Orthodox, and they're not interested in writing. They don't deal with Jewish-Christian polemics. So he discovers the Maskilim, the enlightened Jews. But why enlightened Jews? Remember who these people are. The Maskilim were critics of traditional Jewish society. They were asking for reform, educational reform, cultural reform. They were trying to transform the Jewish community into a new image of what Jews were to be. Enlightened, reading in the sciences, reading in literature, reading beyond the pale, transforming their morality into a universal morality. This was the call of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment. According to Shmuel Feiner, who I don't agree with, but he uses the word, the French Revolution of Jewish life. These were the Maskilim. Of all people, to defend the rabbis in traditional Judaism, why the Maskilim? But here again is the beauty of this ambiguity, of this fluidity of thought. These Maskilim were entrenched in Jewish culture. They all had been educated in rabbinic culture, and they loved Talmud. I mean, you don't have to believe every word of the Talmud, but you can still love Talmud. They love to learn. They love to study. They were deeply entrenched in this, but they also read history, and they read philosophy, and they quote from all the German writers and all the French writers. It is unbelievable how much they read sitting in Eastern Europe, far away from the cultural centers of the West. So Isaac Bear Levinson wrote 2 works against McCall. They were both published posthumously because apparently Moses Montefiore wasn't willing to finance the work after it came out. And it took a long time until it was published, so the impact is not clear until after. But then it sold about 6 or 7 editions of this work. And the work is a profound view of the history of Judaism and Christianity, and presenting argument by argument how McCall doesn't understand the Talmud. One of the most telling arguments of the book is to argue, let's ask the question, what is a rabbinic scholar, says Levinson? He is a person that, first of all, knows the Talmud inside and out, understands language, understands nuance, understands grammar. But beyond that, he knows history. He knows Christian history. He knows languages. He knows Latin. He knows Greek. He is able to converse in the larger culture of antiquity, and thus he's able to apply this to the Talmud. In other words, what he's describing, of course, is himself. But he's also describing the new academic scholar emerging in Judaism. This is not your Bocher Yeshiva sitting around who just studies the Talmud. It is a Talmudic scholar that takes the Talmud and uses it to construct a whole history of the Jewish past. The other figure who was a contemporary, a younger contemporary of Isaac Bear Levinson, was a man named Rashi Fien, or Samuel Joseph Fien of Vilna, one of the great Maskilim of the city of Vilna. The work that he wrote was called Darkei Adonai, or The Ways of God. The work was never published. The dedication page is to Moses Montefiore, and he expected also that he would pay the bills, but he didn't. The work is in 1 copy. I know historians run after the weirdest of things, right? In the archive of the Fien Archive in Jerusalem, it was never published. But it is a wonderful text. It is a text which puts side by side, again, Jewish and Christian history. Both texts, both Fien and Levinson, know so much. They quote Greek and Latin sources. They are so up to date in terms of their Christian history. They quote Catholic historians and Protestant historians, and they try to present Jewish history against Christian history. There is a whole section in this work about Philo. Philo, you recall, the 1st century Jew, was being resurrected in the 19th century, as Arnaldo Momigliano and many others have shown, because the 19th century, Philo becomes a kind of contested figure, whether he is a forerunner of Christianity or he is really a Pharisaic Jew. Is he really part of the rabbinic tradition? And Christians begin to publish Philo. And we also have Jews who are publishing a Hebrew version of Philo in the 19th century. One of the great treatises on Philo in the 19th century is by the Galician philosopher Nachman Krachmel in the 13th chapter of Mored Nevuchei Hazman, the Guide to Perplexity of Our Time, in which he argues that Philo, the Alexandrian, who wrote only in Greek, was a true rabbinic Jew. Again, contesting with the Christians who have made him into a kind of precursor of Jesus and Paul and early Christianity. This is one of the many aspects of the Fiend book, and I could go on about it, but I can't describe it. The final character I want to talk about is a Jew from the Middle East. His name is Raphael Kassin, and he was the rabbi of Aleppo and Baghdad. I know this stretched me way beyond my limits, of course, but here's a Jew sitting in the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire who notices that the Christian missionaries have made inroads into the Ottoman Empire and are spreading throughout the Middle East. And he decides to write two works, one in Ladino and one in Hebrew, against Alexander McCall, in which he offers perhaps not as sophisticated as an argument as the Maskilim, but very deeply heartfelt and a very strong argument about the morality of Judaism and the place of Judaism within the culture of the Middle East. What is interesting about Kassin is he seems to have run off and got involved in all kinds of power struggles in Aleppo, runs off to Europe, and there he seems to have been infected by some Reform Jewish leaders. Comes back to Aleppo, and we have a document written by the British consul. I can't evaluate it, and I can't make sense of it. And Yaron Harel, who is the main historian of this guy, doesn't make much sense of it either. Namely, that he founds a kind of Reformed synagogue in Aleppo, or let's say a less Orthodox synagogue than other Orthodox synagogue. Is that possible? What kind of synagogue? And why would he become Reform after going off to the West and returning to the Middle East? It's a very interesting story of mixture of cultures between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all mixed up in these polemical works. So let me kind of bring this all together. Why is this significant to me? And I go back to my original question, why would a nice Jewish man, I don't know if I'm nice, and I guess I'm Jewish and a man, why would I be interested in a topic like this? And what was fascinating? Well, as I said already, I've always been interested in the history of Jewish-Christian relations, beginning in the Renaissance and going on. And this was my 19th century installment. As you always find, you enter a topic usually through reading somebody's footnote and asking yourself a question. And I just sort of fell on this and became interested and couldn't leave it. The other thing is the mingled identities, the mixed identities. We talk in our own world about Jews for Jesus, and for Jews, this is something that is really bad. But I want to show you that it has a long, I'm not arguing it is good or bad, but I'm arguing that it has a long legacy. And that indeed, the 19th century figures that I'm speaking about here, that there was the possibility from the early modern period on of Jews living in two worlds, or of choosing to be Jewish and adopting Christian elements. We could argue that this goes back to the Conversos, to the 17th century, to the earlier modern period, but clearly in the 19th century it is quite prevalent. And therefore, to define clear oppositional sides between Judaism and Christianity, and not to appreciate how complex the relationship is. It is not always opposition, but indeed it is both love and hate. It is both embracing and repudiating or distancing at the same time. So that aspect of the topic also interested me. The other aspect is the international scope of this. It was an English story originally, but as you see, it enters the Eastern European zone and enters the Middle Eastern world, and therefore it becomes a story not only about ideas, but it's also a story about communication, about journals, about articles, about pamphlets, about the spreading of propaganda. What should be compared, if this story begins in 1839 with the publication in Hebrew of the work of McCall, remember what happens in 1840, the Damascus affair. And we have this wonderful book by the late Jonathan Frankel, which documents the power of the press in taking this story of a blood libel in Damascus and spreading it, the news all over the world. And the irony of this story is that one of the people that writes a defense of the Jews in 1840, a year after he publishes this work against the rabbis, is none other than Alexander McCall, who publishes the work with the signatures of about 100 Judeo-Christians, Jewish Christians, who say this could never happen. Jews could never do the blood libel. They could never use blood of Christian children to make matzah on Passover, an old libel that goes right back to the Middle Ages, as you well know. But again, this story was revived. But the story, as Frankel portrays it, is a story of how knowledge is transformed, how the mass communication networks of the 19th century. And we appreciate this in terms of our own context and what the internet has done in terms of mass communication. How this has transformed a local story into a mass story. Now, I can't compare the Damascus affair with McCall's book, but I can say that the response, both positive and negative to the book, and the spread of this all across Europe, and the kind of response that it elicited on the part of Jews and Christians alike, suggests indeed that it is a story here of 19th century, not of the 13th century, where Jewish-Christian debates were much more limited and affairs around very modest audiences of elites usually. Here, of course, there were mass sermons and the like, but here we have something that is on a much larger scale because the 19th century itself has a means of spreading information that didn't exist before. So this is also true. The other aspect that I want to point out in this story, of course, I mentioned already evangelicals and the state of Israel, the history of Christian Zionism, the complicated relationship that Jews and Christians have even up until today, where the Prime Minister of Israel seems to embrace sometimes evangelicals more than certain Jews, but I'm not going to talk politics tonight, God forbid. But nevertheless, it has a history. It has a long background here, which begins in the 19th century and is therefore worth considering. The history of Jewish-Christian interactions, of intermarriage, of course, is something that Jews today live with, and the figures are astounding. But again, the story begins in an earlier period of time. It begins where Jews and Christians are picking aspects of their tradition and fusing them, uniting them, combining them in very interesting ways. So that, again, the battleground is not so clear between Christian and Jew. There are moving in both directions between Judaism and Christianity, and that fluidity remains a factor right through the entire modern period. In any case, historians are supposed to reveal useful knowledge. How useful this is, I'm not sure. It was fascinating to me. Whether it was fascinating to you, I have no idea. But as I said in the little discussion I had this afternoon, there has to be in this story something that is meaningful for us and relevant. We have to be historians of good tidings and hope. We have to believe that what we excavate in the past is also meaningful and relevant for our lives. I have no particular message to impart that will change your life in this audience, but I do hope that the notion that we have a history of Jewish-Christian relations evolving over time, of both love and hate, of both entanglement and distancing, indeed characterizes the remarkable human interactions between Jews and Christians and others. And I hope that this will continue primarily for the good. In any case, I hope you will find this chapter of Jewish-Christian relations relevant and meaningful even for our own day. Thank you. And you notice I winged the whole thing. So I hope it wasn't too bad. All right, go.
Please thank you. Join me rather in thanking Professor Ruderman. I know that I'm going to moderate questions for everybody. Let me remind you, just for those who need a reminder, that a question is a question. It's a short statement that ends in a question mark. So hopefully we'll have time to fit in as many of those as we can. We have some time for back and forth, and I'll be moderating those, and Professor Ruderman will be answering.
And when I get stuck, David answers.
Okay.
I'm a Sephardic Jew from Iran.
So we've got a microphone for you right over there.
What I would like to ask you, why there is not such an interesting interaction as there was, as you explained, between Jews and Christians, not between Jews and Muslims?
I don't know enough to answer your question fully, but there is a literature, and there is a professor at Yeshiva University who teaches Iranian Jewish studies, I forgot his name, who has actually published a work on Shiite-Jewish relations, and has written considerably about not only the Jewish-Muslim debate, but also the Jewish-Christian debate. But there is a field of Jewish-Muslim polemics, which many Islamic scholars have, and Jewish scholars working in the Islamic period have studied. So while it is, I could answer the question of why Christianity and Judaism are at loggerheads with each other more than the Muslims and Jews. But that's a complicated theological question. But the answer, the short answer is that indeed there are Jewish-Muslim debates. And if I'm not mistaken, again, I don't know the literature well enough, they do happen in Iran in the 19th and the 20th century. And in fact, the story that I'm talking about here is the intrusion of Christians who come into Iran. McCall's work, if I'm not mistaken, was published in Judeo-Persian as well. So indeed, it was for Jews, and it was written, and so the Christians were even making inroads into Persia at that time, there was clearly an awareness of these Christian missionaries. And there, it's very interesting. Kassin answers the question by saying, you know, Muslims have their own problems. We don't like them at all, etc. But the Christians are worse, and the Christians are more immoral, and he goes on, and he uses them as the negative other, and he attacks them more directly. And maybe it has something also to do with the censor. I mean, he had a lot of trouble publishing this work, but I guess an anti-Christian work would do better in the Middle East than an anti-Muslim work, which would be impossible to publish, of course.
I'll just preface the question by saying how excellent your presentation is. Is there a space theologically, intellectually, do you have some kind of a forum online or something? Because I read pretty regularly Jewish intertwined with some of these sites are intertwined. I think Israel 365 is sort of a Christian Zionist thing. There's a lot of stuff online, but I have heard / gotten the impression from both rabbinic Jewish scholars and Christian theological scholar types that when Christians start or can increase practicing the Jewish festivals and Sabbath and so on and so forth, that is a sign of the coming of the Messiah and the Messianic era, whether we look at it as the coming of the Messiah period and or the second coming of the Messiah in the unity Trinity form of Jesus as Christ. So is there a non-biased kind of forum where people who kind of live and breathe this stuff out of interest can just kind of look into it more without being branded a hilaria of one sort or another?
That's an interesting question they asked me, the mere historian. Have you ever turned on these so-called rabbis that are teaching Jewish Christian stuff on television? I tried to watch them, but they're so dumb and they don't make any sense to me that I just turn them off after 5 minutes. But I tried to watch them a couple of times. I have an open mind. You know, I figured they were like McCall, but McCall was a lot smarter. I don't know. I certainly don't take a position on this. I was very careful. I didn't legitimize Jewish Christianity, and I didn't repudiate it. I'm simply trying to study it as a Jewish historian, and I'm trying to acknowledge the fact that it has long history and long roots. Is there a place where we can study this? Well, I think the academy would be a good place to start. In other words, to read academic books on converts, on missionaries, to learn about the larger context in which these individuals emerged. I mean, for me, the most credible record of the past is written by historians. There are good historians and there are bad historians, there are mediocre historians. But for example, although it was written by a person who is extremely subjective, I can't remember his name, but it is a history of Christian Zionism. But I still found it very useful, although at the end it gets very theological and I lose him at the end. It is quite an interesting history of the 19th century. It has Christian Zionism in the title, and there's a long history on this, and I think that aspect of the topic is really worth considering. What was the role of Christians in building Jewish society in the 19th century? And if you go to Israel, there are guides that can take you to all of these Christian sites in Jerusalem, where you can see, including the London Society site and their church and so on, it's all still very much there. And a number of Israeli historians have actually published on Jewish-Christian relations in the 19th century in the Holy Land. So we do have a whole literature. I mean, I can't reel it off right at the moment. But there are several very interesting books that describe the historical picture of this, and you will learn about the various voices that emerged throughout the 19th century. And it is a fascinating history, and also shows you to what degree English society and European society were saturated with these millennial ideas which affected Jewish-Christian relations and had an impact. I haven't talked about the political context of emancipation and all of that. I simply talked about the millennial aspect of it, but clearly they're all together, and they're all very interesting. So I guess my faith is in historians, and I'm sure you can get your other sources of truth. That's the one I have to offer. You're calling on him.
Can you just give one or two brief examples of his work against the Talmud? It's a whole book, but just one or two examples.
Yeah, I mean, he has a long section on Shvo Chamatcha al HaGoyim, for example. Pour out thy wrath on the Gentiles from the Passover Haggadah. And that's very interesting because it's put in a millennial context with Elijah, opening the door and all of that. And he's saying, how could they, it's one thing to say it about those horrible Catholics. I can identify with that. But us Protestants, look, we befriended you and so on. How can you say that kind of thing? And it's very interesting the way he proceeds here. He knows that the flaw in the Christian argument was relying on midrash, was relying on the homiletical statements of the rabbis, which cannot be used as demonstrative proof of anything. I mean, these were utterances of rabbis. They tell stories, they tell homilies, et cetera, et cetera. So he avoids using midrash, and what he does is he goes to the standard liturgy of the English prayer book, which was published in English translation by the 19th century. In other words, the Orthodox Jewish prayer book. And there he quotes regularly from the prayer book. He even finds a prayer, believe it or not. I didn't look this up, but he claims it's there. A prayer in honor of Moses Montefiore. And he says, this is real idolatry. How could you pray for your rich people? Now, I guess I could understand this in part. I mean, I do know Jewish Federation culture a little bit. No, I'm only kidding. A prayer to Moses Montefiore, which he points out, is found in this prayer book, and he gives the page and the reference. So, in honor of, yeah. So one example is the attitude towards the non-Jew, and many of these things he publishes out of context, and his Jewish respondents well answer him. The other thing is the women. In other words, he praises Jewish women, but he argues, how can you say every morning, blessed, O God, who didn't make me a woman? What kind of statement, what kind of religion could utter such a horrible thing? So he picks this out. I mean, this is all pre-feminist stuff, but he's found it all, and he points out, this kind of stuff. So it is, when you read it for the first time, it's not like it's all new. I mean, these arguments have been around for hundreds of years. But the way he poses them within the context of 19th century culture, they have a modern ring, and they are effective. And that's why Jews were alarmed and felt the need to respond.
Thanks, Professor Ruderman. It was awesome.
Where are you? Oh, way back
I'm right
there?
here.
Okay. I can't see, I told you. Yeah, go on.
I'm just wondering about the term Jewish Christian and if it's pretty universal in the literature you're looking at as opposed to something like Christian Jew or Protestant Jew. I'm coming at this question because I've been looking at German sources that are talking about Jude Getaufte und Ungetaufte. So I'm just wondering, like, what comes first as the descriptor versus the noun?
There is a recent book, help me, Annette Reed. Yeah, Annette Yoshiko Reed, who was at Penn and now is at NYU, on Jewish Christians, where she defines the term much more carefully and talks about it within the antiquity, first of all. And she's talking about late antiquity, and that's where most of her work is. She's a brilliant historian who we unfortunately lost to NYU and was at Penn for many years. But take a look at her book for a clearer definition of the use of Jewish Christian. I've seen many variations. I'm using it simply as a shorthand, but I'm not using it in any definitive sense. There is also a book in the 19th century by a guy named, what's his name? Darby. Michael Darby, which is called the Jewish Christian Movement in the 19th century. Now, he uses that word, I think, not very carefully. I mean, what do you mean by a movement? But he's collected a cluster of individuals who he puts in this category, who are all trying somehow to fuse Judaism and Christianity together. So clearly there are, and see how he defines the term. But I'm not sure I can, answer it definitively, but take a look at her work, which, brings it back to the antique question, but also she comes up to the modern era as well.
So you've told us a lot about these intellectual arguments among evangelical Christians and the defenders of the Jewish perspective and so on. Talk about Jewish Christians. Can you put it in numerical perspective? What are we talking about in terms, are these little fringe elements, how many Jews converted? How many Jews became Jewish Christians in terms of the whole body of the Jewish people?
You killed my whole lecture now, see? Very few, very few. Right. No. When we get to quantifying intellectual cultural history, we've lost. But seriously, London Society spent millions and millions. They were supported by the king and queen. They had unbelievable resources. And the kind of ways they documented themselves, there's so many magazines they published and so many books, and you would think that they're, global reach in a way that you can't imagine. Yet the number of converts were in the hundreds, They did succeed in converting by going after poor, particularly in London, offering them free meals. One of the economic arguments in the old paths is about how can the rabbis tell the poor Jews of London not to go to our kitchens and buy our food on Passover any time. That's horrible. You're letting them starve just for your silly kosher rules. And he's sort of making fun of them. But clearly, if they succeeded at all, it was with these relatively illiterate and very poor Jews who were coming to London Society for economic reasons entirely and had no other place to go. And indeed, Stanislaw Hoge and others make fun of the missionary students who McCall produced. Many of them, he said, were relatively illiterate and were simply using this to rise up the economic scale. So if we're looking for a quantitative answer to this, they were total failures. But nevertheless, there was also a perception out there. This book, I would argue, given the number of copies that were produced, we're talking thousands and thousands. I tried to figure out, I couldn't figure out a total publication, but there were times when 10,000 were published in 1 year, where 5,000, they were constantly being reproduced throughout the 19th century. And I have records until the end of the 19th century of missionaries that are still using this book for instruction. Essentially what happens, and here is the irony, the book becomes irrelevant because more and more Jews, as one missionary points out, don't know enough Talmud to really appreciate McCall's arguments in the first place. so that ultimately it's too effective, it's too sophisticated for them, and therefore they need more simpler works to missionize the Jews. But in terms of number, the London Society and the missionaries in the 19th century were failures. Most of the Jews did not convert, but if they did, they came from the very poor illiterate classes.